When I was growing up, I spent a lot of late nights in the car. My parents would play music through the speakers, and I'd drift off to sleep listening to what has now become my favorite genre of music, jazz. I'd close my eyes and envision complex melodies shaping up into notes on a page. I wanted to play what my favorite jazz musicians played, but when I got the opportunity to pick up the saxophone, my notion of the music changed completely. I learned that the complex motives and lines of my childhood weren't read off of sheet music, they were improvised, and that completely blew my mind. So today, what I want to focus on is that improvisation. More specifically, how jazz and improvisational thinking can teach us to trust in new, innovative ideas. But first, let's take a walk through history for some context. Jazz grew out of a blues and ragtime tradition that were mainly popular in the early 1900s in cities like New Orleans. Now, with the performing of musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, to name a few, jazz by the 1930s, 40s, and 50s had become much more mainstream. Now, one of the fundamental features of jazz is that much of the performing is improvised, and that improvisation can stretch from having a rough framework and building off of that framework, or on the complete other side of the spectrum, improvising entire concerts, like the pianist Keith Jarrett, which is also truly incredible to watch. Now, a common objection I hear to this focus on improvisation is that jazz can be anything. Any notes, any rhythms, it doesn't matter. And usually those objectors proceed to play a random sequence of notes in a random order and proclaim their jazz virtuosity. And obviously, I can't deny that that type of music is improvisational. But what I want to focus on is not the act of improvisation itself, but another aspect of jazz, closely linked, but often goes overlooked. That skill is conversation, or being able to dynamically create with fellow performers on stage. In essence, what that means is answering and acknowledging the ideas of your partners and turning them into something interesting. Well, why talk about it when we could just listen, right? You can find it in almost any good recording, but the one I'm about to show you is a recording by a jazz quartet led by the saxophonist Chad Lefkowitz-Brown. Pay particular attention to the end of the saxophonist solo and the beginning of the pianist solo. I think you'll notice something quite interesting. So if you didn't catch it, the end of the saxophonist solo was the spark for the pianist solo. I'll play it again just in case. So my point here is that these types of melodic trade-offs can't and aren't replicated by those random improvisational note bursts that I was talking about earlier. So if we think about the music as simply improvisational, we fail to grasp the component of jazz that has to be spontaneous. And as a listener, it's these moments where one can connect to what's happening on stage or even in the recording studio. Now, this connection between the two musicians, this dynamic connection, grows trust. Because if I take a musical liberty, you can carry it on, like in the clip. But there's also an implicit agreement that if I play something that maybe sounds strange, you can take that as well. And that's where some of the most interesting ideas come from. Now, this fundamental trust is what opens the gates to innovation. Because if I take a musical liberty and you trust my decisions, I know that you will come with me on the journey. To me, that is what's extremely authentic and valuable. Now, trust-building innovation doesn't just have to apply to jazz. This type of thinking can help quash feelings of doubt and inadequacy in almost any discipline. A common example that comes up as a student is the frustration over partaking in a group project where members don't carry their own weight. You hear it a lot. And while it sounds like a childish complaint, if we understand the principle on this fundamental level, it can translate very well to teams everywhere, but also individual struggles. The key is to recast the problem as one of trust. If I, of my own volition, recognize my own lack of trust in the group, that's a gateway, because it all comes down to expectation. If I can expect how my peers are going to act, that's at least some progress, even if it means they're not going to do anything. But on the other hand, I can empathize instead of complaining, and that's a step in the right direction. On the individual level, it's just a matter of what one expects from themselves. And positive self-trust is something held in high regard by psychologists all over the world. But the key distinction is not to have pure, unadulterated confidence, because someone can be outwardly reserved but still have booming self-trust. Now, I'd like to close with a short story about an astronomer named Kepler. Kepler, perhaps one of the most influential astronomers in history, wanted to devise a way to musically connect the planets of the solar system. And I know it sounds crazy because you can't even hear music in space because there's no air. But he did something quite unusual. He ratioed the velocities, or how fast the planets are moving relative to the sun, at their closest distance and farthest distance from the sun. So for Earth, that would be in January and in June, respectively. And he used those ratios to mimic frequency ratios, which could produce musical intervals. And some ratios produced nice-sounding intervals, like this one. But when Kepler produced the ratio for Earth, and I think you know where I'm going with this, the ratio dictated this. It's essentially the Jaws theme song, except the notes are being played together instead of separately. So the fact that our planet, our beautiful planet, would produce such a quote-unquote frightening interval may be disheartening. But I believe that we can recast our perspective and understand that this dissonant interval is not something to frown at. It's just a musical liberty. What we all do with it remains to be seen. Thank you.